To go?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so good morning, everyone. First of all, it's really a great pleasure to be here, and I really want to thank Chiara and the Institute for European Studies for inviting me to speak to you today about climate policies, social inequalities, and just transition. And as Chiara already mentioned, this is only one dimension when it comes to climate-related inequalities, the other being unequal contribution to climate change and the unequal impacts of climate change itself. So I'll just focus on this one dimension and very much zoom in on what has already been said. Though I will also refer to these, as Chiara also said, these dimensions are all interconnected, so I'll refer back to them as well. And I want to start with a little bit of perhaps context to some of what's already been said, and maybe I want the best ways to start with a picture. And I want to ask, does anyone not recognize what this is? Yeah. Does anyone want to tell us about it? Or I can tell you about it? Okay, you're shy. It's early. Yeah, so this is the Gilets jaunes, or the Yellow Vests, and they were a popular protest movement that spread very quickly across France in 2018 and 2019, and it really gained a significant amount of attention, not just in France, but also internationally. And it was first sparked by the introduction by Emmanuel Macron in 2018 of a carbon levy on diesel that would increase the price of diesel, which would disproportionately affect people in lower socioeconomic groups, especially those in the countryside who are dependent on their cars for being able to work, but also for the basic necessities of life. And this was introduced in parallel, or shortly after, in fact, after wealth tax cuts were announced that would effectively benefit rich people. And so while the trigger for the protests may have been climate policies, the real complaint of the protesters was, and I think this is really important to remember, it was a base about existing structural socioeconomic inequalities, social injustice, and different kinds of social divides, poor, rich, city, country, and so on. And of course, we know the movement grew very rapidly, became very heterogeneous, there were different interests, parts of it became violent, and so on. But I think it's really important not to lose track of this basic concern that climate policies interact with the existing social conditions to exacerbate existing inequalities, or sometimes even produce new inequalities. And that for many people, this poses an existential question. So it's not about, you know, what will climate change bring in 20 years? It's really about how am I going to feed my family tomorrow? And in this respect, I think it's also telling that the protests really continued after the carbon levy was scrapped. And so it was really not until they had reassurances from the government that a range of social measures will be put in place. And I'm sure many of you already knew this, but I just wanted to start by saying that I think it sort of became a point of discussion about, oh, people don't want climate policies, and that was not really the main point here. It was more about social inequalities, class struggles, and so on. So then we come into 2019 when the European Green Deal was announced, and the Yellow Vest protests were very much in the minds of EU policymakers. And so the Green Deal committed, and also the climate law before that, committed to a just and inclusive transition that leaves no one behind. So that's that little bit at the bottom there. And the just transition mechanism, which I'll come to later, it was one of the very first instruments that were introduced under the European Green Deal. And in the next few years, we know what happened. Europe was hit by the COVID pandemic with really devastating health, but also social and economic consequences. It was strongly affected by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the related gas supply shortages, and all of this certainly contribute to a really deep cost of living crisis and energy crisis across Europe, which made the existing socio inequalities even deeper than they had been before. And so in the middle of all this, there was a strong backlash against the European Green Deal, not only by certain parties in the European Parliament, but really also on the streets. And unfortunately, this provided the opportunity for far-right movements, some of which have now become quite mainstream, established and influential parties, to use anti-climate and anti-EU slogans to gain political ground and to present climate policies as running counter to the interests of working people. And in the last couple of years, I would say, we've also seen a real shift in the narrative at the European level, from the European Green Deal and climate neutrality, prosperity for everyone, to industrial policy and competitiveness. So we can see that reflected in the Clean Industrial Deal that came out a few weeks ago. So what I want to do today really is to take a closer look at some of these dynamics, and that's why I wanted to give you the context, because what I'll say really strongly links to the political context. So I want to talk about the different ways in which climate policies create social inequalities, then how the current just transition mechanisms at the EU level actually deal, or I would say not deal with those. And then I want to make some suggestions on what is still needed to promote the just transition, and here I would love to discuss that with you. So how do climate policies create social inequalities? So climate policies have essentially three types of social effects, which we can call the effects on jobs and employment, the distributional effects linked to energy price increases, so this was already mentioned, and of course this was the Gilets jaunes example, and the effects on local communities, whether that's displacement from their land, whether that's impacts on health due to environmental effects, or even the loss of their traditional livelihoods. And so all of these effects can both, as I said, make existing inequalities worse, but also create new ones. So if we consider first the effects on employment, so of course this is again already mentioned, probably the first thing that we think about is the effects of the phase out of fossil fuels that's required by the European Green Deal, and that will have effects on workers in the fossil fuel industries like coal, but also gas and oil. And so this will inevitably mean that those workers will have to lose their jobs. And in coal alone, that's in Europe, I think as of a few years ago, maybe now it's a bit less, we're talking about 200,000 direct jobs and many more indirect jobs, which probably compared to the overall number of working people doesn't sound so much, but what we have to remember is that those industries are highly concentrated in certain regions, and where this tends to be even the main or a major, in any case, economic activity. So it's not just the workers who stand to lose out themselves, it's also their families, and it is their communities, and as well as workers who are dependent on the jobs on that industry, but also within the local community. And so then we have as well this effect that this also means the loss of tax revenue for local authorities, and so we're really talking about significant socioeconomic effects and socioeconomic decline that is concentrated in certain regions. And we're also talking about, as Chiara already mentioned, the loss of a sense of identity of those communities whose families have worked in these industries for generations. And here I just want to show you, I mean, the data it's quite outdated now, it's from 2018, but this is showing, so the European Commission identified the regions that are at highest risk of socioeconomic decline in relation linked to the transition. And so we can see that there are sort of different effects spread out across member states, and many of those correlate with coal and oil regions, but not only. I mean, those are generally sometimes weaker socioeconomically weaker regions. Sorry, and we're also talking about not just job losses. We're also talking about job transformations, because lots of sectors will have to completely transform their processes. So this can mean steel and chemical production, for example, but it will also mean something like the automotive industry, which needs to change fundamentally as the combustion engine is being phased out by 2035, which is again due to the relevant regulation under the European Green Deal. And currently, the automotive industry accounts for about 13 million direct and indirect jobs across Europe. So that's 6% of total EU employment, and I think it's about 8% of EU manufacturing employment. So that's massive. And we're already seeing really significant impacts across Europe, in countries like Germany, with well-known brands like Audi and Volkswagen, and maybe you may have heard about this in the news, but they're closing plants and laying off workers. And this includes, maybe you read about this in the news, the closure of the Audi Brussels plant located in Forêt, so not very far from here, and this was 3,000 local jobs. So that's quite a lot. And of course, there will be new jobs as well. It is actually predicted that in theory, at least the transition would create as many, if not more jobs. We don't know whether this will happen, but even assuming that it does, The problem here is that these jobs are not necessarily attractive jobs, good quality jobs with good terms and conditions. And they also might require different skills, which requires training and reskilling, and money to develop and run training schemes, and which may just not be possible for everyone. I mean, not everybody can reskill. Older workers may struggle to do so, but not only. And one of the dilemmas is that it's one feature, for example, coal mining jobs, that they are relatively secure, they're well paid, and they're unionized. And this may well look different in the jobs that are created, and the data actually emerging so far suggests that they are generally not good quality jobs and rarely unionized, which of course means declining worker power. And then we also have questions of equity and access to these jobs, where we see that the existing labor market disadvantages and inequalities can play a role in who can get these jobs. So, for example, women are already underrepresented in fields that will be, in industries and fields that will be critical to the green transition. So they are underrepresented in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics jobs, so STEM, and also in the relevant education programs. Then we have workers who are lower skilled and who may struggle to find alternative employment. So I think ensuring successful and also socially just and equitable job-to-job transition is an enormous challenge. And remember that this comes, so all of this that I've mentioned, it comes on top of the need to support workers who will probably lose their job because of the direct impacts of climate change. So if we think about agriculture, droughts will mean that arable land is destroyed. They might mean that those, the kinds of crops that are grown might have to change. So that will mean job losses because of climate change. And it's the same in tourism. I mean, ski resorts in the Alps are melting. And that is actually the traditional livelihoods of, whole villages and cities and so on. So that's it on the employment side. And then, sorry, I'm just going to fast forward. So any questions so far? No?
It's a lecture, but also an opportunity to teach. So you can ask questions along the way.
Okay. So now turning to the second type of effects, that's the distributional effects we already mentioned. So again, we're talking about here primarily the effects of energy prices, of using carbon pricing mechanisms as a tool for incentivizing the reduction of emissions. So at the EU level, it was already mentioned, the central mechanisms we have in place is the emissions trading scheme, and a new emissions trading scheme for road transport and buildings was created under the European Green Deal, because those sectors contribute massively to emissions, and so it was difficult to see how we were not going to do anything about it. Now, the problem, however, is that the additional costs resulting from the operation of the scheme will likely be reflected then in the final price of the product and passed on to consumers, for whom these two things, so energy and transport, are pretty basic requirements. And this will disproportionately affect people who are already in vulnerable situations. This again was mentioned. And those who tend to be in a lower income and for whom this energy price increase just is a much higher proportion of their overall income. And this puts people at risk of energy poverty, which is defined in one of the EU instruments that I'll come to later as a household's lack of access to essential energy services that underpin a decent standard of living and health, including heat, cooling, lighting, and energy appliances. And the preamble to it's the recommendation of fair transition, which I'll talk about, suggests that 8% of the EU population is affected by energy poverty. That is tens of millions of people. And this is also distributed unevenly across member states. So this is a graph showing, so I couldn't fit the whole thing, so I've just got the EU average and above. So it's also distributed very unevenly across member states. So we can see that in some member states, like in Bulgaria, but also Lithuania, Portugal, Cyprus, the rates are really staggering. And I come from Bulgaria personally, and their energy prices and energy policy in general has been really at the center of political debates. I mean, this is now over a decade ago, but it effectively toppled the government because people were so unhappy. So this is quite a significant problem. And then So people on a lower income, also vulnerable smaller businesses as well, are the ones who will be the hardest hit by energy price increases. And they're subject to a kind of triple injustice. So aside from being the ones hardest hit, they are also the ones who are probably contributed least to climate change, and also the ones who are least able to invest in green technologies like electric vehicles, which, by the way, are still incredibly expensive, and solutions like insulation for their homes or solar panels and so on. And like the employment effects, there will be more significant impacts for people who are subject to structural disadvantages. So there's disparate impacts across characteristics like gender, age, but also racial and ethnic background, disability, migrant status, class, and so on, as well as the intersection or combination of these characteristics. So those who are the most marginalized will also be those who are the most affected. And together with a colleague, we looked at the position of women in the green transition, particularly of younger or older women, women with disabilities, and migrant women. And we found that whereas women generally are more impacted than men, because they tend to be on a lower income, on average, women subject to multiple disadvantages will be much more affected. And so here you can sort of see a graph that shows this is at risk of poverty or social exclusion rates. And we can see that it is young migrant women who are at the highest risk of poverty and social exclusion, more than older migrant women, much more than native women, and slightly more than younger migrant men. So we can see how these kind of multiple disadvantages have a cumulative effect, and this is really, really relevant also in the context that we're talking about. Then I think maybe one group that did gain significant attention was single mothers. So single mothers are a group that will be particularly affected because they are at very high risk of poverty and social exclusion, and they were actually quite active, I mean, in the Yellow Vest movement. So you know, those groups are coming to the front, but of course they tend to also be the ones who have the least capacity to defend themselves for various reasons. And then I want to come to the third category of social impacts that I mentioned at the beginning. So this is the effects of local communities in terms of displacement from their land, the loss of traditional livelihoods, or environmental damage that has an effect on the health of local populations. And these tend to be linked not to the phase out of fossil fuels, but linked to the phase in of new industries and associated activities like the mining of critical raw materials, but also the development of new energy infrastructure or manufacturing capacity in industries like battery production, for example. And this, I would say, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but this category is, in my view, was sort of largely neglected in EU discussions on this topic. But I think it's really important as well because it can really have serious implications for social and environmental justice, and because as the green transition advances, we are really likely to see a lot of conflicts over land, and those are likely to sort of bring up some of these issues. So to take a few examples, maybe, again, something that you may have read about in the news, a few years ago, the mining company Rio Tinto received permission from the Serbian government for a large-scale development of a lithium mine. And I think this was potentially mentioned by Sanja Bogojevic, who delivered this lecture last year, and whose work I would really, really recommend you read. And one of the central objections here, and it sent thousands of people on the streets of Belgrade and other cities, and the central objection here was that this project will destroy the livelihoods based on farming and food production of the local communities. And this is something that people deemed much more important than having a lithium mine, which might generate wealth for the country or even generate jobs, because they also argued that the jobs that are being proposed, I think it was 2,000 jobs that Rio Tinto was proposing, that would not be enough to replace the lost livelihoods. And now, although I know Serbia is not in the EU, but it is a candidate country, and the effects of the European Green Deal are absolutely being felt outside the EU, because the EU is going around striking deals with various countries, including Serbia, to exploit the reserves of lithium and other critical raw materials. And I think Sanja has also looked at critical raw material mining effects on indigenous Sami communities in Sweden. So that's also a really interesting case example, and I would really recommend that you have a look at that as well. Another example are some protests in Hungary a few years back, and these were against the construction of a battery plant owned by a Chinese company. And then the local communities there argued that the local supply of water will be strongly affected. So battery plants are very, very, very polluting. And they argued that the water supply would be contaminated, and that this would damage the health of local communities. And then, of course, looking beyond Europe, and maybe this is the even bigger challenge in this context, this race for critical raw materials that has been set off and pursued by the European Green Deal will incentivize mineral extraction projects in countries across the world, especially in the global south, to be supplied to Europe to facilitate the transition of European economies. And I would say this is something which poses a risk of what I would even call green extractivism. And this is likely to produce some of the same injustices that we've seen in the context of extractivism, so exploitation by the global north of the global south, the displacement of minority and indigenous communities from their land, environmental damage, and poor working conditions, and potentially also forced labor, and so on. And we're already seeing this when it comes to lithium mining in particular, and there have been some very large lithium mining projects in South America. And I think the work of Thea Riofrancos, I'm not sure if you've heard about her, but is really, really excellent on this point. And again, I think here in this sort of global north, global south, and local communities versus development projects, it's important to remember that those who are likely to be most affected are also those who are least likely to be able to defend themselves. And here we know from decades of work of environmental justice activists and scholars that the undesirable and polluting activities are often located close to marginalized and low-income communities, and this is likely to be reproduced here as well. So maybe to sum up these far-reaching interventions that the European Green Deal introduced, which we really absolutely need to address climate change and to reduce greenhouse gases. This will put significant pressure on social structures that are already unequal, and it will exacerbate what we might also call these cracks in the current system and create new cracks as well. And this will have uneven impacts within member states, between European and non-European countries. And again, I stress that it's also the countries that are least well off that will be least able to invest in green technologies and also in resilience. And this is maybe something that you've already talked about in the context of the Paris Agreement, but I won't go into this now. And the result has looked like this. So this is Belgrade in 2021, the protest that I mentioned. This is Sofia in 2021. So this is my home country. And this is actually a protest against both job losses in coal mining, which generates about 40% of the electricity in Bulgaria, and against rising energy prices. And this actually, so the picture in the middle says, Timmermans, how are we going to live without electricity? So it was really very directly targeted against the actions of the European Green Deal and the European Commission. And this last one you probably recognize as well. Yeah, I see nodding heads. Does anyone want to tell us about it? No? Okay, so yeah, these are the tractors of the farmers' protests that happen across different European countries, and they don't neatly fit into the different types of effects that I just talked about. And there were many different types of concerns that were being raised there. But part of the concerns were also about socioeconomic impacts. Now, being a farmer, especially a small farmer, is a really tough job. It's not very profitable, which is why farmers generally receive subsidies through the Common Agricultural Policy, and fewer people want to do it, especially young people. And so some of the arguments that were advanced here is that the new regulations on pesticides and on various other things will be really, really harsh on small farmers and push them out. And so the Commission retracted, I think pulled back quite a lot of its proposals on this front, especially the pesticides one, which is a shame because it was also set back to the green agenda. But I think even more problematic was the fact that this dispute, among others, gave a platform for far-right political parties across EU countries to sit on this topic, and the same thing happened in relation to some of the other effects that we're talking about. I can speak about Bulgaria. I mean, it's not the only reason, but it's not even far-right, it's an ultra-right party. It's tripled its share of the vote, and this was one of the topics that they really talked about quite a lot. So again, using it as a chance to attack the EU, to attack climate policies, and to win over the people who are really worried about, justifiably worried about, the declining material situation. So maybe I'll pause at this point in case anyone has any questions, but you don't have to. No?
Actually, the first reasons for the increasing of the fixed costs for the production in the farm sector was indeed the increasing cost of energy. So
Yeah.
I think they are directly
Yeah.
concerned about the Green Deal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, I mean, I couldn't find a nice picture, but many of the slogans that they put on was really, it was very directly a protest against the European Green Deal. But not in the sense that, oh, we don't like this, we don't believe in climate change, because I think it was also very easy to demonize some of these movements and to say, oh, these people are just climate deniers or they're far-right parties. Like, they're not. I mean, sure, some are, but that's not the main concern. I think they're saying, you know, okay, well, if we can't afford to basically operate anymore, we're not going to have jobs, and you're not going to have food. So, you know, what are we going to do about it? But yes, so fuel price was one, pesticides was another one. I think regulation of green farming was another one as well.
Yeah, that was the second one, the pesticide costs.
Yeah.
And the third one was bureaucracy and legislation.
Yeah.
Implementation. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also, that was the time where the nature restoration law was being negotiated as well. And among other things, one of the key issue was the obligation negotiated to keep a part of the land uncultivated.
Yeah.
To make sure that biodiversity and conservation was restored. And that was, again, a direct influence. And part of those movements are very diverse at their core.
Yeah.
You find some of the farmers who are having completely different claims compared to others in terms of generation, but also in terms of farming practices. So agri-farming is one of the areas where that was included in the protest, but for different reasons, because the permit was delayed and they needed to have that permit issued, and it was a big pot. Sorry. Yeah,
so yeah, I think it's very complex, and I think it's easy to simplify the narrative and say, oh, farmers don't want climate regulation. It's too simplistic, so it's really important to have a closer look at some of the groups and really what's driving this as well. Anyone else? Okay, we have more time at the end. Yeah. So how do the current just transition frameworks of the EU not address these issues? So maybe I'll start with, you know, coming back to this idea of just transition. So from what I've just said, it is pretty clear that the transition to net zero will not just by itself be socially just. And what we need is some kind of public support, so public policies that are put in place for those who will be most affected, legal and governance mechanisms to put in place to make sure that the transition aligns with the principles of social justice that Chiara talked about, so the distributive, procedural, and recognitional justice. And the concept of just transition, so has anyone not heard about it or know what it means? Okay, so the concept of just transition is something that the trade unions sort of came up with or developed, starting in the US back in the 70s and 80s, and then it was called something else, but eventually had this banner of just transition. And essentially, you know, in a broad sense, it means that the people who are affected by environmental policies deserve some kind of public support, and also a say in the decisions that affect them. Especially, of course, because it came from the trade union movement, participation and empowerment of those affected was incredibly important. Now, the concept is now being used in slightly different ways. The ILO guidelines on just transition from 2015, so around the same time as the Paris Agreement. So they focus on the world of work. So they focus on transitioning industries, but since then it's become a little bit broader, so now includes, or can, to some people, include things like energy poverty and sort of broader social justice goals, effects on local communities, and so on. But just bear in mind that it can often be used in quite a slippery way. I mean, I keep coming up against this issue when, especially when trade unions talk about it, they still like to keep it relatively narrow. When NGOs talk about it, they want to keep it broad. Then when the European Commission talks about it, they mean reskilling and upskilling of workers. Then when activists talk about it, they mean social transformation. So it's good to bear that in mind. But the basic idea is that we have these socially just effects. We need to support those who are affected, and we need to give them a voice. And the EU has, I don't know how well you can see this, but anyway, I've put them on the side, the titles. But the EU has put a variety of mechanisms in place already. So I already mentioned the Just Transition Mechanism, which was the very first EU instrument put in place, and that's to address the socioeconomic effects of the transition on the most affected regions. So in practice, this has primarily covered the EU's core regions, so we kind of already have a bit of a limitation. It's not across all sectors, and it's not across all regions. And it can only be used for a limited set of activities, so some of which relate to supporting local economies and economic growth, but that mostly means that money go to companies. And then few which cover upskilling and reskilling of workers, training and education, and social inclusion measures. And in the way that this Just Transition mechanism worked, it had 3 pillars. The most important one, I would say, of which is the Just Transition Fund. And to receive money from the Just Transition Fund, member states had to submit territorial just transition plans, and that was with proposals on how they'll spend the money. Now, these were really different across the member states, both in terms of their contents or the measures proposed, but also in terms of their quality. I mean, some were really detailed, good ideas, and others were really just 5 pages and felt like a bit of a copy and paste. And the analysis that was done by different organizations of the plans really showed that the majority of the money is going towards companies and not directly towards workers and their communities or the local authorities. And there's some of the plans that I have looked at, honestly, there was almost nothing on social welfare. And to the extent that there were social measures, they were focused on the upskilling and reskilling of workers. And while some of these plans mentioned the need to support underrepresented and vulnerable groups like women or young people, people with disabilities, and so on, a lot of them would also just ignore the problem, this problem altogether. And one of the very striking things, and Chiara has written about this, is that it was just very often not clear what kind of consultation there had been, whether there had been consultation, who had been involved, how the results were taken into account. And the Just Transition Fund does have provisions on consultation, so it requires some form of consultation, but there isn't really a prescribed procedure which defines who the relevant stakeholders are and guarantees that those who are most affected can actually take part. And overall, I would say it's sort of much more focused on the distribution of benefits and burdens, so this kind of distributive aspect of justice. But even then, it is just not really clear that the money is going into the right hands, and the projects that are being developed are really ones which are sensible. So the experience with the fund, unfortunately, suggests that it's not doing particularly well on actually promoting just transition. And I think one of the issues here is that also that this sort of system where member states propose themselves what they're going to do, it also means that inevitably there will be great variations between member states, not least because they have different capacities. Also, I mean, not just in terms of administrative resources, but also in terms of technical expertise and also political will. You know, is it a political priority? So I think that if you're a worker in the affected region, there was really nothing in this fund to guarantee that you and your community will receive support and that you can be involved in the process. So there was nothing really tangible and forcible. There wasn't a right to receive anything from this fund. There wasn't a right to be involved. There was just a hope that the central or regional government will propose some sensible measures that will benefit you and your community. And then I think another fund, I don't know if you can see there, the middle one, which Chiara already mentioned, that was the Social Climate Fund. So this was a fund that was proposed to address the impacts of the ETS2 on vulnerable groups and vulnerable businesses. And it's not started running yet, so it's from 2026. It runs from 2026 to 2032, and it will be 90 billion euros. Now, the sense that I gather from the Commission and those working on it is that they're really trying to do a better job than under the Just Transition Fund. So there are efforts being made to make the process better, more transparent, and more inclusive. But I guess we'll have to see what happens, because I think at base also with this fund we have a similar concern, which is that it's not clear whether funds will reach the people who need them the most. And again, it depends on the kinds of measures that member states propose and so on, which could be something like direct income support to vulnerable people. It could be renovations of buildings in disadvantaged areas, but it could also be subsidies for home insulation or electric vehicles that require a certain amount of contribution, which vulnerable people can't afford. And the other problem is really the estimates show that this amount of 90 billion euros is just not enough to cover the actual investment needs. And the role of community participation is, again, pretty unclear at this stage. And so maybe to kind of sum up from these two funds, the common problems is that they are limited in time, limited in terms of their amount, limited in their scope, so the precise problem that they cover, and they rely strongly on member state discretion and do not actually guarantee a certain just outcome or involvement. And then the sort of third instrument that was put in place, and at the time that this came out, we felt on the kind of social side that this was a bit of an afterthought. Now that may not be the case, but it's a little bit maybe what it felt like. But it was quite good. So this is the Council recommendation on fair transition, which came out in 2022. And it's a sort of much broader instrument that takes a whole of society approach to just transition. So it's not just by certain sectors or certain regions, but really it's sort of quite all-encompassing, and so encourages member states to put in place a range of measures on like active support for quality employment, like fair tax benefits, like access to essential services, but also support for social dialogue and citizen participation. So it does really contain some very, very important measures. Social protection as well, I forgot to mention this one, but it's also very important. It contains some very important measures, but the problem is that as a council recommendation, it is non-binding. So it relies entirely on whether member states are willing to do something along all of these different issues, and the evidence that we have so far. I mean, it is true that it's also been a challenging political situation across the EU, but the evidence we see so far is that member states are in fact doing very little. So these sort of three are the main or the core just transition mechanisms, but we also have a few other ones who I hope you can see there. We have the European Pillar of Social Rights, which was mentioned. So that's kind of the whole social policy agenda of the EU, in fact. The European Pillar of Social Rights is also non-binding, but there were, in the previous Commission, there were quite a lot of social initiatives that were linked to the pillar. As a labour lawyer, I can tell you that we are expecting almost nothing to emerge in terms of legislation, but of course it remains the kind of big social pillar of the EU, and also it's one to which the European Green Deal and also the Clean Industrial Deal kind of cross-refer to. Then another important thing that we looked at was the Next Generation EU funds, so the Recovery and Resilience Facility. There's also money from the Cohesion Policy Framework, the European Social Fund Plus, and so on and so forth. So I won't go into all of these instruments anymore, but maybe the main point to say is that, again, this was funding but no binding obligations necessarily, so no enforceable guarantees for workers or citizens on how these resources should be distributed, and very little by way of participation, especially of particularly disadvantaged and underrepresented groups. And so these sort of, I would say the majority of these instruments primarily focus on the two effects that I talked about before. So the first two effects, so the employment effects and the distributional effects. And there is much less on these third types of effects, on the effects of on local communities, which I also mentioned before. And then, of course, if we're talking about environmental effects that could impact the health of local communities, there, of course, it's the whole wealth of European environmental legislation applies. So, of course, this goes some ways towards protecting communities. And very importantly, what also applies in the cases of environmental decisions with environmental implications is the principles of the Aarhus Convention, which I'm sure you've already learned about. Next week. So next week you should learn about Aarhus, the principles of the pillars of the Aarhus Convention on information, public participation, and access to justice on environmental matters. And so these are implemented in EU law through a regulation of various directives. And they can be quite, so that they can go some way towards addressing some of the concerns about participation in this context. So if we imagine development of a lithium mine, or the extension of a lithium mine, will be a project that has significant effects on the environment, which will trigger an environmental impact assessment, which does have provisions for the involvement of local communities in consultation. So that's already something that's very helpful. But the problem here is that it is still about environmental effects and not about social effects, and those might be the ones that local communities are in fact more concerned about, and there's space to voice them, but it's still not necessarily the focus of the discussion. But maybe another interesting development that I want to mention, sorry, I actually did not, yeah, sorry, this is the slide. One thing that I maybe want to mention is the Critical Raw Materials Act, which was sort of a surprising, it's not part of the Just Transition framework, the Critical Raw Materials Act. I'm not sure if you studied it yet, but its aim is effectively to secure the supply of some critical raw materials for Europe. And it requires what it calls strategic projects, so they receive certain benefits under the Act. So these are required to comply with social and environmental sustainability standards, both within and outside the EU. So these include respect for labor rights and meaningful engagement with local communities and social partners. So this was really positive, actually. And it was kind of what we might call a social conditionality, social and environmental, in fact, conditionality. But it only applies in the case of critical raw material mining, and it is not entirely clear how that might be enforced. So again, Sanja has done some great work in this respect. So maybe to just wrap up this part and see if you have any questions. The bottom line here is that there are by now quite a few instruments that either directly or indirectly concern the social impacts that I outlined at the beginning, but they are relatively fragmented. They only partially address the sort of huge challenges that people are facing, and they have certainly not been enough to give workers and their communities the reassurance that people will not be left behind, as the European Green Deal promised. And so I want to get to my last part, which is what we can do about this. But first, maybe if you have any questions on any of the different instruments. I'm sorry, I know it's a lot of information that needs to sink in, but just in case, and we can talk about it afterwards. Okay, no, it's good. So, what do we do to ensure a just transition? because going back on climate ambition is not an option. Climate change is still very much happening and also threatening the lives and livelihoods of people across the globe. So we need to rapidly reduce emissions and transition to net zero economy. So what kind of measures can we put in place, especially, I mean, I'm a lawyer, so especially on the legal side, to ensure that the transition is socially just? Obviously, we need a range of things, but I really, after sort of lots of reflections over the last 5 years on what went wrong, I really want to start with this question of participation. Because I think that the people who are most affected really need to be involved in a meaningful way. And this is not only because this can harness the valuable knowledge and lead to better outcomes. This is one argument often advanced for participation. It's not only because it increases the acceptability of climate policies, which is also something on which research has been done and it has been shown. But I think at base it's just a matter of respect and dignity, because people shouldn't feel like something so significant is happening to them. I mean, our ambition is to change fundamentally our societies and our economies. So they shouldn't feel that this is happening and that they can't have a say in it or they can't do anything about it, because I think this really contributes to this feeling of disempowerment, which pushes people to protest justifiably. I mean, when you're really unhappy about something, you should protest, you should signal your discontent to the government. But again, what's really concerning is that part of this protest translates into voting for anti-democratic and populist parties that claim to speak for the people against the powerful elites. And it's not only because of the green transition, obviously, but I think it does play a role in this larger feeling of disempowerment. And now one argument that is often advanced against public participation is that it will slow down decisions that need to be made very quickly. And I think this was possibly part of I've definitely heard this argument again and again, certainly in the context of the European Green Deal. But this just doesn't make sense if you don't involve people from the beginning and then people are really unhappy and then there's a backlash and then you have to scale down your ambition. This just doesn't really make sense. So I think we need to remember this is a really big thing that we are undertaking as a society, and that part of the challenge, an essential part of the challenge, it's not a side thing, it's not a nice thing, it's a key part of the challenge is to actually figure out how we can involve people and bring them along in all of this, because they will have to sacrifice something, like as you were saying before. So how can this be done concretely at the EU level? There are different options. We might not have so much time to talk about all of them, but one possible avenue, which Chiara has written about, is to take inspiration from the Aarhus principles and ensure that they apply not just to environmental decision making, but also to transition plans and policies at the national, regional, but also local levels. And here, I think it's essential to ensure that participation is meaningful, which of course also means ensuring that people have information in advance, that they actually have the opportunity to attend, because it's not taking part during working time, or to make the process inclusive, to provide the relevant education, and so on. And I think a really important part here can be played by local authorities, grassroots organizations, and trade unions. And if we think about trade unions and workers' organizations, I mean, one already established avenue of participation, established in some countries, not all, but in many countries, is workplace democracy. So that means worker information and consultation at the workplace. It also means collective bargaining. It also means collective mobilization through trade unions, and so on. So this is also an opportunity for workers and their unions to bargain for their interests and to ensure that new jobs are created, which are decent jobs. So, as Chiara said, I'm a labor lawyer who puts on an environmental law hat occasionally, and I really think that this emphasis on participation is one that is crucial to both of our disciplines, and where I think the relevant frameworks can be better integrated to mutually support each other. So that's a little thought bubble, if anyone has any ideas. Then obviously, apart from frameworks for participation, we also need to see substantive support measures. So to ensure not just that people are shielded from negative effects, but they can also really make the most of the opportunities that the green transition presents. And so we need to make sure that workers have an access to training, upskilling and reskilling. We already talked about this. So this also means that in the first instance to make sure that there are such training opportunities that are provided by employers and by the state. We need to facilitate job-to-job transitions, ensure that new jobs are attractive, but we also need to have robust social protections in place, because the reality is that some people will lose their jobs and they will not be able to find new jobs in the places where they live or for whatever reason. And so there needs to be a social safety net in place as well. And this also means things like essential and adequate public services like healthcare, education, elderly care, housing and transport, and energy as well. And so this will obviously require a lot of money. So I won't talk about that too much, but I think we need to see a much greater investment. I mean, I don't know if you've been following the news, but the Commission has just announced an 800 billion that it will hope to dedicate to ramping up defense spending, and so why not prioritize these social objectives instead? And one thing that I already mentioned is this idea of social conditionality, so benefits or funding that is already being dedicated for other purposes. So, for example, to invest in renewables, I think that is something that could be made conditional on complying with certain social standards as well. And maybe the final thing here is that we need new social legislation. So, of course, I would say that as a labor lawyer, I already said we're not expecting any. But one initiative that is sort of in the making is a just transition directive for the world of work. So this is something that the trade unions, but also other organizations have been calling for a while. There is a project that's ongoing on developing what this might look like, and it will include worker participation, it will include rights to training, to collective bargaining, and so on. So definitely watch this space over the next few months. There will also be a European Parliament own initiative report on this in 2026. So what we are hoping on the trade union side is that this might actually become quite a big and significant initiative also on the side of the European Commission. So fingers crossed. And then the last thing I want to mention maybe, and I want to finish with this, is that one thing that I again come up against a lot is the sort of divide between climate objectives on the one hand and social objectives on the other hand, that also translates into different Directorate Generals of the Commission, different ministries at the national level that work separately on these issues. So what we really want to see is a bit more, we don't want to see trade-offs, we want to see integration, we want to see creative thinking on how these two objectives can be pursued at the same time. And so I think that's really, really important because we need to maintain a high ambition for both environmental and social objectives. I'm almost out of time. So what I wanted to say sort of by a few words of conclusion was to comment a little bit, and I would really like to hear your thoughts about this and any questions on the recent developments that we've seen at the European level. So the Clean Industrial Deal was published. This is kind of the new European Green Deal 2.0, but it's quite different in terms of its the narrative it presents. So it does reaffirm this commitment to a just, fair and inclusive transition. And it even mentions things like social conditionalities and so on. But the problem that I see with it is that a lot of the narrative is centered on competitiveness and economic growth, remaining competitive in the green economy vis-a-vis countries like China and the US. Even though it's linked to the objective of climate neutrality, those objectives are very sort of economic in nature. So one of the things that we're quite worried about is that it presents just transition as this narrative of upskilling and reskilling workers, because workers are an important sort of factor in competitiveness. And so we'll see how this all develops over the next few years as the various sort of clean industrial deal initiatives are proposed by the Commission. But I think it's really important to remember that people are not just skills, and the economy needs to work for the people and not the other way around. And again, to stress this point that people need to have a voice in the decisions that are being made here. And so I really hope that this is something that the EU and national policymakers will take seriously in putting in place frameworks that can empower affected workers and communities so that they can really participate in this new future that we're shaping together. So thank you all very much for your attention. I'm sorry this was rather long. I'm really eager to hear your comments and questions.